Hey, it's Dr. Mitch. Let's get into this tobacco and nicotine lecture. I promise to keep this to an hour or less. We're just going to walk through. I don't think you're going to have a ton of surprises, but there's some details that are really important to focus on, and definitely read the chapter in the book. So we're going to just get into what is tobacco, go through the different methods of use. The history is actually really intriguing. I know you guys don't necessarily love anything that started before 1991, but this is an intriguing story. We'll get into the compounds, health consequences. You know a lot of them, whether or not there's an environmental consequence, and talk about some of those data. So the thing to remember is that tobacco is the plant and nicotine is the chemical. Um, we're going to have this be essentially part of the minor stimulants with caffeine, but it works very differently. So tobacco was selected to now have higher nicotine for at least some products, and the nicotine itself is a stimulant. It's going to work in that acetylcholine system, and it has all those hallmark stimulant effects. Tachycardia, allegedly improved cognition, right? Decreases in the capillary size, a lot of increase in blood pressure. You'll know it when you see it. So, what are the species of tobacco? Well, there used to be literally hundreds, and they were all grown in North and South America, and this was how they sort of were discovered. Meanwhile, they've been actually around in the native world in the Americas for a couple of millennia. And tobacum, which was actually from South America, was the one that seemed to catch on. Jean Nicot, who we'll talk about later, showed that it was easier to grow, and it just really got a big monopoly. Spain, of course, was taking over down in South America, so they sort of had the monopoly, if you will. There's another type called rustica that is actually hard to get unless you're in South America. It's super strong, outrageously potent with both tar and nicotine. So just know that that one's kind of the more robust one, if you will. And then it contains alkaloids. Alkaloids are just chemicals with a single nitrogen in the molecule. Don't drive yourself nuts for that. And then this understanding that it's got medicinal uses, allegedly, or religious uses, as an entheogen, as they say. So the bottom line is these are really familiar plants, and then once we got them industrialized, we kind of went wild with them, when in the past they were just sort of minor medical or religious products. Well, so I think you're probably familiar with all the methods of use, but let's essentially confirm that cigarettes are far and away the most common among the ones that are available. I'm guessing you would know a cigar if you see it, but they're markedly larger and have markedly more tar and nicotine simply because of the size, but also the tobacco used is often stronger depending upon where you get them. Those were very hip in the 90s for a while. I'm glad to see that some of that kind of died down. Pipes literally, ground tobacco put in the end, and became this whole fetishized ritual, if you will, with the fire and the tamping it down and everything. Hookah is basically one of those water pipes that were popular in the Middle East for quite a while, and even in parts of Asia, and created this illusion that, oh, I'm smoking this through water, so it's probably safer. The data on that are not particularly compelling. What seems to happen is folks have the cooler smoke in their lungs and end up holding it in longer, and then all the respiratory irritants, like the nitrosamines, get deposited because there's more time for them to just catch on your lungs. Chewing tobacco, that delightful habit where you've got a big plug and put that between the cheek and gum and spit all day, it did free up your hands, which was good, at least in Missouri where I grew up, but then you also had to spit somewhere, so it created another set of problems. And from a health perspective, especially when we didn't understand tuberculosis, you can imagine how that was a real hassle. Snuff has a couple of meanings now. This moist snuff you see here, this Copenhagen stuff, is really ground finely, often has a whole lot of flavorings in it, put between the cheek and gum. But classic snuff from the basically 1500s on was ground really, really fine and then insufflated, right? Put up your nose in a way that would have this abrupt, really dramatic onset and then often lead to sneezing and blowing your nose. And this got framed as a medical use, that somehow this was cleaning you out or helping you release toxins and all this other crazy nonsense. So it's still available. I wonder if I have it. I used to do a little demo of it when we were in person, but it kind of takes its toll on you. And the e-cig was really part of this trend to try to develop a safer cigarette, and I would say safer, but not safe. And truth be told, they weren't that much safer because people tended to compensate. So if the cigarette had low nicotine, they ended up smoking more of them, or taking deeper inhalations, or holding them longer. So it's really hard to use this in a kind of harm reduction way. And the e-cigs are at least not containing some of the congeners we're talking about, the tar and things like that, but they still have nicotine and definitely produce withdrawal and tolerance, the hallmarks of dependence. Oh, for a while, especially in the 90s, I had to emphasize that cigars were not the dramatic harm reduction approach everybody thought. You definitely don't drive yourself nuts with these numbers, but just understand that there's still definitely a markedly greater risk of lung cancer and then mouth, throat, and esophagus. So Freud was a big cigar fan and actually had to have part of his jaw removed. My wife's grandmother used to see Anna Freud pushing him around in Vienna in a wheelchair without it. After that kind of surgery, you can imagine what your face looks like. It's really rough. And doesn't have the chronic obstructive pulmonary disease that you see from cigarettes, but still more than non-smokers. And then coronary heart disease, which we're going to get into, is also exaggerated. And truth be told, it's just not a habit that has a lot of advantages given the dramatic drawbacks. And so this smokeless approach seemed to be also an attempt at harm reduction, but truth be told, this was more popular earlier on than the smoking for quite some time. So essentially got the chewing the loose leaf, which is just far and away the most widely available. Leaves are shredded and basically sweetened almost always with like licorice and sugar. So you're also going to end up getting this big insulin release in response to the sugar. Sugar obviously improves energy as well. So this nicotine stimulation and sugar stimulation combo was quite the big deal. But in the Midwest and South, we always had the plug. So it's literally the shape of a brick, if you can imagine pushing the tobacco leaves together under a whole lot of pressure until they're practically joined. And then you can literally just cut off a piece and put that between your cheek and gum. And it was markedly more potent in part because it was so concentrated. I don't see the twists anymore, but basically it was like a rope made out of tobacco leaves and wound really tightly. And then that was actually a way to keep it fresh because there was an outside leaf that sort of bore the brunt of the oxidizing. Wow, yeah, I haven't seen one of those in quite some time, but they were popular on the reservations out west, at least. For snuff, we want to draw the distinction between insufflated snuff, like the inhaled up your nose kind, and then the much more popular snuff that's just ground and put in your mouth. Because it's ground so small, it's really a skill, if you will, to even keep it contained in your mouth. And so I saw the Skull Bandits, now they have the packet, so it's all inside there and you just put the packet in your mouth, which I guess is sort of efficient and certainly has some potential to not make your teeth so bad. But the drawbacks, of course, are increased tooth loss and then all that mouth and gum related set of symptoms. We're going to get into those. So despite this attempt to make these a sort of harm reduction approach, there are tons and tons of negative consequences, and they tend to develop uh, fairly rapidly. And this was kind of a surprise to folks when Copenhagen and things like that were coming out. So you'll notice these tumor type lumps in the jaw or the neck. It's not clear if they're benign, but they often start out as precancerous type cells. And it's not often even right where you may have held the tobacco itself. So people get these lumps and they don't figure out why. It doesn't seem obvious that the lump in their neck stemmed from chewing tobacco, but in fact that is the case, and you need to intervene right away and definitely quit immediately. These discoloration in the lips, so you see either white or red spots, often right where the tobacco is held, and it's often the beginning of basically these two other disorders we're going to talk about here. Leukoplakia, which is these white patches in the mouth, and these are also abnormal cell growths that are basically precancerous, and again, a pretty flagrant sign. It's time to intervene. Erythroplakia is the red ones, and so just you can imagine knowing the distinction between these is a nice multiple choice item. Bleeding in the mouth and bleeding in the gums, and what's sad is then people don't understand the need to floss a lot, and what is a surprise, folks who are heavy into smokeless tobacco use aren't necessarily big fans of flossing and brushing, and so you see these horrible implications for just your mouth health. But then that inflammation is also going to be a challenge for your whole immune system, and the later risks for coronary heart disease seem to stem in part because this constant inflammation and exaggerated work for your immune system. And then the difficulty speaking or swallowing. So this is kind of odd, and maybe partly because of this habit of holding a lot of spit in your mouth and then spitting it all at once. And so then your throat is dry for a while. And so then you have this problem when you first start to speak in the day if you've had it in your mouth all along. And that, again, is also another pretty outstanding index that it's time to go ahead and intervene. And then I did want to just show in Chile in particular, they really plugged these advanced filters, as they kept saying. So the notion that somehow you were going to have a filter that was going to get most of the nasty parts of tobacco smoke out of it, and then lo and behold, you were not going to die, or something like you could smoke and get away with it. And this was really a scam. In part, unconsciously or not, people found out where the holes were, and just it turned into a habit of holding their fingers over these so they could get a bigger draw, and they didn't even realize they were doing it, and they ended up getting a markedly larger smoke inhalation on each breath. And then this development of low tar and low nicotine cigarettes is really great for brand fading, but I just haven't had the impressive I just don't find the data very, very impressive, because even if it is low tar, people do end up compensating. They end up smoking more or holding their hits longer. These are good for brand fading, which is a step in the treatment of cigarette smoking, and I'm going to talk about that later. So yeah, I just wanted to emphasize that the Juul was bigger a few years ago, but turned into this kind of vaping sensation, and it was real high risk for middle school and high school kids. Even this kind of form of administration, so Cialis and Viagra, basically the erectile dysfunction meds were going to be administered this way. They thought maybe it'd have a faster onset, and then you could basically get to it. The irony of that, of course, is that long-term exposure to cigarette smoking decreases capillary size and then increases the rates of erectile dysfunction. And the irony of them using that same form of administration seemed pretty thick. But more than anything, because these do contain nicotine, and because teens don't necessarily know they do, the addictive propensity is really rapid. And so data suggests that at least a third of the e-cig users end up smoking cigarettes later, often as soon as 6 months later. In contrast, folks who didn't use e-cigs were less than 10% starting smoking. And then what do teens say is in their e-cigs? And I thought this was intriguing. Um, they don't really have to list all the ingredients that are in there, but it's certainly clear which ones have nicotine and which ones don't. And there are 0% nicotine vape juices, but it seemed pretty unlikely that folks were using these. A lot of folks thought they had THC related e-cig. Those are certainly not legal in New York State unless you've got a medical marijuana card. And I was surprised that literally under 15% suggested that they knew they had nicotine in there. All right, well, don't drive yourselves nuts with specific dates on the tobacco history, but we want to talk about basically the general trends. So, tobacco has been around for a couple of millennia here, but in the European world, it didn't get introduced until Columbus came to, well, he didn't come to America, but came over near here, and they found the natives what they call drinking smoke, right? So they put a reed and put some tobacco in there and light it on fire, and then they thought they were drinking it. And actually, Columbus went nuts when some of his men were doing it. There were a whole lot of legal sanctions against smoking in the beginning. People were really resistant, but the Native Americans seem to have been doing them in their rituals, so this entheogen, for literally millennia. By the 1600s, certainly post old Jean Nicot, tobacco was basically equivalent of money, and so in the colonies and in Europe, tobacco took on all this extra value, really. Jean Nicot, Nicot, he was the French ambassador to Portugal. He was a physician and basically introduced tobacco as a medicine to the Queen, Catherine de' Medici at the time, who you can tell she's Italian, but she was married to one of the King Henrys, trying to join with England. She happened to have migraines. Apparently, the vasoconstriction helped with her migraines, and she thought it was really great. But she didn't smoke. She used it as snuff. And so the chewed and smokeless were really big throughout 1700s as the U.S. is becoming the U.S. And this was a lucrative crop. So a whole lot of folks literally, said, oh, the colonies were saved by tobacco in some sense, trying to grow hemp or cotton back then was really tough, so that this was a chance for them to make enough money and then basically break away from the United Kingdom and have enough money to fight the war. Literally hundreds of years before the smoking kind of caught on, but once it did, we got the first Surgeon General's report on smoking saying it really is no good. So if we sort of think about it, it's primarily smokeless early on, a lot of snuff in the 1700s, chewing tobacco in the 1800s, and by the 1900s, cigarettes are really gaining popularity. Part of that was the invention of the cigarette rolling machine. Suddenly, you could make them markedly quicker and inexpensive, and as soon as they got cheap, then a whole lot of folks were willing to try them, and then the addictive process basically made these a commodity, made them very popular with folks. Well, so we're 20 minutes in. I'm going to say go ahead and take your little break. See if you can write yourself a couple of questions, and I'll be all fired up for Nicotine 2.